Everyone, welcome back to Behind the Veil. I do sincerely apologize for the slightly late release of this video. We had some pretty big technical difficulties while we initially tried to record this video, so we had to start from scratch. So again, I do sincerely apologize for that. But we are slightly changing how these videos work. So first, you can now see our faces. So hopefully this will make the video a little bit more engaging for everyone. Instead of just looking at a bunch of slides, you now can see people. And then I guess one last thing before we dive into today's video. We do have a coffee link up, so if you do enjoy the videos that we are creating, you can go to the link in the top line of the description and buy us a coffee, which I find the name of the website ironic for the type of channel we are. But anyway, without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into today's topic, which is Murderous Mormons, or the Danites. And the topic of the Danites is quite a controversial one. Most Mormons, or most members of the church, have no idea who they were, or if they did know about them, what they did. And members are generally told that they provided bodyguard services to prophets and or protection for the saints from the mobs. And they don't really generally question any further than that. But the reality is, the Danites did far more than just protect the prophet or the saints. And in fact, that was not their true purpose at all. The Danites were used to intimidate and threaten church people who left the church. And in several cases, they did enact violence against these individuals who left the church or were attempting to leave during the reign of Brigham Young. And as we'll see in this video and in future videos, Brigham Young was quite a messed up dude.
Yeah. Yep.
And according to the Joseph Smith papers, in 1838, Joseph Smith and other church members fled from Ohio and moved to Missouri due to the attacks of the mobs in Ohio. Members of the church and apologists claim that the Mormons were constantly attacked and persecuted for a very simple and humble reason: their faith. However, if you read newspaper articles, journals, exposés, and a bunch of other things from the 1800s, it paints a completely different picture of why the Mormons encountered mobs and violence and all of that. So if we take a look here, according to Annalisa Webb, who was one of Brigham Young's many wives, and she actually wrote book Wife Number 19, because she believed she was a 19th wife, but she actually wasn't, because there was other wives she didn't know about, and it's a whole thing. But Wife Number 19 is a fantastic book. I highly recommend everyone watching to read it. But she says here, the outrages committed by these Danites and others like them caused the expulsion from Missouri. So it wasn't because they were being persecuted for their faith or anything like that. It's because of what the Danites did and how they enacted violence. And we'll see that more and more as we go throughout this video. So from the Joseph Smith papers on the topic of the Danites, it states some Latter-day Saints organized a group known as the Daughters of Zion, or the Danites, whose objective was to defend the community against descendant and excommunicated Latter-day Saints, as well as other Missourians. Danites intimidated church dissenters and other Missourians. For instance, they warned some dissenters to leave Caldwell County during the fall of 1838, as tensions escalated during what is now known as the Mormon-Missouri War. The Danites were apparently absorbed into militias largely composed of Latter-day Saints. And these militias clash with their Missouri opponents, leading to fatalities on both sides. In addition to that, I apologize, I accidentally X'd out of my script here. In addition, Mormon vigilantes, including many Danites, raided 2 towns believed to be centers of anti-Mormon activity, burning homes and stealing goods. So they're not just providing protection. They are burning down homes. They are stealing goods. They are attacking these towns. And while anti-Mormon vigilantes targeted and sometimes killed non-combatant Latter-day Saints, Danites primarily confiscated or destroyed property they feared could be used by their opponents. So it's not that it was actively being used against them. It's like, oh no, these people have stuff that they could use against us. No, it was just like, oh, they're being too preemptive. They're saying, oh, these people have it, we need to take it. And we'll see as we continue that there were other reasons why they were stealing and raiding these towns. And historians generally concur that Joseph Smith approved of the Danites, but that he may have not been briefed on all of their plans and likely didn't sanction the full range of their activities.
Yeah, and of course the church is going to claim this, right?
Because they need to make Joseph Smith look perfect, right?
Right, exactly. So, but the reality is he did encourage the saints to do a lot of things to what they termed Gentiles, which we will see a little bit later on. So I wouldn't be surprised if he knew a lot more than the church wants you to think he did. But as we said, the church claims that Joseph Smith was not fully briefed. But I find it a little interesting that he wouldn't be fully briefed on a militia group that he fully approved of. They also claim that the group only lasted for about 5 months before it was disbanded, and we will show that this is demonstrably false.
Yes.
John Lee himself, who is a known Danite in his own book, wrote about acting under the direction of Brigham Young in Utah as a Danite. John D. Lee was the chief leader of the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which was done, under this kind of Danite umbrella, and was clearly far later than 5 months after the death of Joseph Smith. So we know that the 5-month idea is just false. Anyway, we'll get further into Brigham Young's use of the Danites to intimidate members who had lost their faith and to enact the blood atonement, and that will be a little bit later on. But I want to go back to Anna Eliza Webb's book, Wife Number 19. She states, quote, altars of sacrifice were loudly recommended, and the victims were advised to place themselves thereon voluntarily. If they would not become willing sacrifices, they became involuntary ones, or somebody took the matter in hand and saw that the atonement was made. So she's talking about the blood atonement. They wanted to make altars of sacrifice where people would be blood atoned. And they wanted you to offer yourself up voluntarily. But if you wouldn't, they would blood atone you anyway. So usually this mysterious, quote, somebody that was going to blood atone you involuntarily was one of the Danites. They also called them destroying angels. It was a band of men regularly organized for the purpose of putting obnoxious persons out of the way. It is said that this band had its origin in Missouri in the early days of Mormonism before the settlement of Nauvoo. But they never became so notorious until the Reformation times. Reformation was under Brigham Young, when their peculiar talents were called into play and their services in constant requisition. As loudly as the Mormon leaders talked to the people about doing their, quote, dirty work themselves, they nevertheless shrank from soiling their own fingers. So they employed others to do their own share and contented themselves by saying that such a person ought to be used up, and thinking no more of it until they receive the news of a mysterious death. So this is Anne Eliza speaking of the Danites' blood atonement and these mysterious deaths, which were actually blood atonements. And we will speak directly of some of these stories later on. She details a speech that was given by Sidney Rigdon that incited the Missouri people to anger with the Mormons, and they did this frequently. It's just not something that the church wants to speak about, but it is in Joseph Smith Papers or in the Journal of Discourses. It's there. They just don't talk about it. So Sidney Rigdon says in this speech, "We take God and all the holy angels to witness that we warn all men to come on us no more forever. The man or set of men that attempts it does so at the expense of their lives. The mob that comes to disturb us, we will follow until the last drop of their blood is spilled, or else they will have to exterminate us. We will carry the war into their own homes and families." Again, he's saying they are going to go to innocent women and children and their homes and kill them and destroy them. This is completely disgusting. He goes on, no man shall come into our streets to threaten us with mobs. If he does, he shall atone for it before he leaves the place. We this day proclaim ourselves free with a purpose and a determination that can never be broken. No, never. So here we have Sidney Rigdon stating directly that they are taking this violence to innocent women and children. So if you can start to put the pieces together, that the reality is they're not just being persecuted for their religion. Back to the Joseph Smith papers, the Danites were an oath-bound military society organized among the Latter-day Saints in Missouri in the summer of 1838 to defend the church from both internal and external opposition.
Yeah, and it's crazy how watered down the Danites' purpose was in the teachings of the church. If you actually look at the Joseph Smith papers and all of that, you can really see how awful these people were. And we'll go over a story towards the end of this episode that will really drive home how despicable some of these actions were. But before we dive into that, going into a little bit of the history of the Danites and how they were founded, we're going to start with the name of the group, which was apparently taken from a passage in the Old Testament. It's taken from Micah, and we'll go over that right now. Micah 4:13 is where it's from, and it says, Arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make thine horn iron, and I will make the hooves brass, and thou shalt beat in pieces many people, and I will confiscate their gain unto the Lord, and their substance unto the Lord of the whole earth. So, the fact that they're using an Old Testament passage about beating many people into pieces is disturbing to say the very least. And it sadly accurately describes a lot of the actions of this violent militia group. And the LDS Church, from its very inception, uses in large part Old Testament concepts and rituals and melds them in with Christianity. Just a little bit of here, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and creates their own thing. And we go over a lot of what they've mixed with Christianity and Masonry in one of our previous videos about the endowment. So I highly recommend everyone go watch that. But anyway, so they named the Danites after the Israelite tribe of Dan because the LDS Church believes itself to be of the house of Israel and the true people of God. This society is patterned after Israelite armies from the Old Testament and were organized into groups of 10s and 50s and so on. And it's also important to note that the Danite Constitution vested executive authority in Joseph Smith and his counselors who made up the first presidency of the church. So these Danites are reporting directly to Joseph Smith and the first presidency of the church. And when apologists and LDS leaders try to distance Joseph Smith and other church leaders from the actions of the Danites, we actually see right in here that they reported directly to Joseph Smith. And we'll see that even more as we go throughout this episode. And Joseph Smith actually did attend at least one of the society's meetings, although we do not know exactly how many, but there is documentation of at least one. And not only did this group seek to intimidate dissenters from the church, they also sought out to promote political candidates that were favored by the leaders of the Mormon church in an attempt to enforce their consecration efforts. LDS Church members believe that the law of consecration, and actually believe in the law of consecration, and actually covenant to the law of consecration in the temple endowment. Again, if you want to learn more about the temple endowment, check out our previous video. The law of consecration is essentially a totalitarian regime that controls all financial assets of its people. However, it's given a religious name to kind of water it down and make it more palatable, to the members. It means that every member gives all their money, possessions, time, talents, and even their own lives, if necessary, give it all to the church. And then the church redistributes all the assets back to the people according to their needs. And I don't know if it's just me, this sort of sounds like communism, And
Yeah, an extreme form of communism.
exactly, it's
Yeah.
insane. I mean, I can't believe that more people don't realize this, especially members of the church. But anyway, we'll go
Yeah.
into more about the law of consecration in future
They think
videos.
it's a higher law, like a higher way of living.
Exactly, and I don't get it. So if
If you're righteous enough, then you'll do it pretty much. Yeah.
it's insane to me. Maybe they should go live in like North Korea or Russia or something. They might feel better out there.
Yeah.
Anyway, so they were trying to install political leaders in the U.S. government to approve of the church's agenda of polygamy and other ideologies that were illegal at the time. And not very many people know about this. Right before Joseph Smith died, he actually ran for president. um,
Yeah.
and there were actually other members of the church in high up positions of the government. I believe there were several in the U.S. Congress, and one of them was actually charged with treason, if I'm not remembering correctly. We'll go over that in future videos, but it is crazy.
Yeah. Yep. There were definitely hearings of treason. So we'll get into that. So, as much as the church tries to deny the assassination attempts by the Danites and their violent acts, they've been reported in many newspapers and other publications from the 1800s. So, if you most LDS members will not read anything outside of what the church publishes.
Mm-hmm.
And so they don't know this. But if you actually go to the newspapers and all the reports of the time, it gets really interesting. So the following was published in the St. Louis Bulletin. And it says, quote, on the evening of the 29th, 12 of the Danites dressed in female apparel approached my boarding house. Now, this is General Robinson that's speaking, in Nauvoo, with their carriage wheels wrapped in blankets and their horses' feet covered with cloths to prevent noise. About 10 o'clock, for the purpose of conveying me off and assassinating me, and thus prevent disclosures. So they were trying to prevent him from disclosing things about the Mormons, and that's why they were trying to assassinate him. He says, but I was so admirably prepared with arms, as were also my friends, that after prowling around the house for some time, they retired. So here's a prime example from a newspaper of a man reporting about an assassination attempt by the Danites to prevent him from disclosing illegal activities among the Mormons. The assassination attempt on Missouri Governor Boggs in 1842, this was another huge thing. Boggs, in another report, Boggs was home relaxing when an unknown gunman shot 4 balls through the window. 2 of them hit him in the skull, 1 struck him in the neck, and the last one struck him in the throat. It's any wonder he survived. He was found alive, but was not expected to survive. One newspaper at the time prematurely published an obituary column stating that he had been killed because they didn't expect him to live. And Wilfred Woodruff, who would later become the prophet of the LDS Church, wrote in his diary that Boggs had just been assassinated in his own house and fallen in his own blood. Thus, this ungodly wretch has fallen in the midst of his iniquity, and the vengeance of God has overtaken at last, and he has met his just deserts, though by an unknown hand. This is a future prophet of the LDS Church calling this man an ungodly wretch and basically celebrating his death and saying that it was the vengeance of God, which I find very despicable. A letter to the Nauvoo Wasp, which was another newspaper publication. This was a Mormon newspaper edited by the prophet's brother William, said Boggs is undoubtedly killed according to report, but who did the noble deed remains to be found out. I don't think a lot of the members of the church at that point knew how this assassination attempt was ordered, but we're going to get into that and how it was. So according to the publication Why William and Jane Law Left the LDS Church in 1844, written by Grant H. Palmer. It was published in John Whitmer Historical Association Journal. It states, And this is going to go over a few more details again of the assassination attempt and then explain how it was ordered by Joseph Smith. So it was on June 27th, 1844, the day Joseph Smith was killed. William Law recorded in his diary. He, speaking of Joseph Smith, was unscrupulous. No man's life was safe if he was disposed to hate him. He set the laws of God and men at defiance. Law is referring here to both the attempted murder of himself. So the Danites did attempt to murder William Law. He was the one that was publishing the Nauvoo Expositor, which was destroyed. So the attempt on his life, but also the attempted assassination of Lilburn Boggs, who was governor of Missouri. On May 6, 1842, a gunman shot the ex-governor of Missouri, Lilburn W. Boggs, through a window at his residence in Independence, Missouri. 2 bullets penetrated his head, a third lodged in his body. Miraculously, he lived. Almost immediately, suspicion fell upon Joseph Smith being involved. The governor of Illinois, Thomas Carlin, wrote Joseph Smith a letter saying that it was common knowledge that he had prophesied that Boggs should die a violent death. So here we have the current governor of Illinois writing a letter to Joseph Smith saying that it was just common knowledge everywhere that Joseph Smith had made this prophecy that Boggs was going to die a violent death, the previous governor. Then we have John C. Bennett, who was an assistant to the first presidency of the church at the time. And he wrote, in 1841, Joseph predicted or prophesied in a public congregation in Nauvoo that Lilburn W. Boggs, the ex-governor of Missouri, should die by violent hands within 1 year. George M. Hinkle, in a June letter to Smith, also wrote, denying your having prophesied the violent death of Boggs won't do. Too many people have heard you, myself among the rest. And just prior to the attempted assassination of ex-governor Boggs, John C. Bennett said also, I was then on terms of close intimacy with Joseph Smith and asked him where Porter Rockwell had gone. Porter Rockwell was a Danite. Gone, said Joseph Smith, gone to fulfill prophecy. So here we have Joseph Smith then also claiming that he had sent Porter Rockwell to fulfill this prophecy. And this was a firsthand account from John C. Bennett of what he was told.
And Joseph Smith is arrogantly making these prophecies about the death of the governor of Missouri prior to the assassination attempt. And many individuals knew the purpose of the Danites was to intimidate or threaten outsiders. And many knew that Porter Rockwell was likely the one Joseph Smith would use to fulfill the prophecy. Then we have a statement of William Law about Joseph admitting that he did in fact order the assassination of the Missouri governor. So the second counselor in the first presidency of the church, William Law, said Joseph had personally told him that he had sent Rockwell to assassinate Boggs. Law declared, let me tell you that Joseph Smith told me the fact himself. The words were substantially like this. I sent Rockwell to kill Boggs, but he missed him. It was a failure. He wounded him instead of sending him to hell. Thus,
that's so bad.
I know. I can't believe the prophet of the church is saying these things, wanting to assassinate the governor and sending him to hell. So, Anyway. Those 2 members closely associated with Smith in the first presidency of the church report their first-hand conversations with Smith about the Boggs assassination. So Joseph H. Jackson claimed to have been hired by Joseph Smith to finish what Rockwell had failed to do. Jackson came to Nauvoo from Georgia and met with Joseph Smith on May 19, 1843. He brought with him a rather sordid past, but Smith gave him a job of selling his building with lots on commission. According to Jackson, Smith said that I was just the man he wanted. Jackson then told Smith that he could release O.P. Rockwell, who at the time was confined in prison in Missouri for his attempt on the life of Governor Boggs. Well, he said, if you will release Porter and kill old Boggs, I will give you $3,000. So I know $3,000 may not sound like a whole lot, but you gotta think that this is in context of the early 1800s. $3,000 is a huge amount of money for that time, and it's still quite a bit of money for today. So Joseph Smith is literally hiring a hitman for $3,000 to kill Governor Boggs. Several days later, both he and Smith took a ride out on the prairie all the way out and back. He pressed me to kill Boggs and said that he would pay me well for it. Again, he is saying that Joseph Smith is going to pay him to kill Governor Boggs. All the while he was urging the killing of Boggs, he insisted that it was the will of God, and in God's name he offered me a reward for his blood. So now he's saying that God is the one who's sanctioning this and going to give the reward for this murder. It's insane. And you'll see all throughout the early church, Joseph Smith is using God's name for these despicable acts. And continues on, this was all done with an air of sanctimonious gravity and with a look of innocence that would make one almost believe that the prophet really thought that he was acting under the command of heaven. I was utterly astonished to see this man concoct the most hellish plans for murder and revenge, and yet, with pertinacity, insist that it was right in the sight of God. Joseph Smith used the name of God as a license to enact whatever he desired, and in using the name of God, he was able to convince others to implement his despicable ideas. The name of God was Joseph's personal rubber stamp of approval for any criminal behavior he wanted to do, and his followers mindlessly accepted it all because the name of God was always thrown around in support of whatever Joseph concocted. You'll also see this a ton in polygamy. You can check on our previous videos on polygamy where Joseph is like, oh, God told you to marry me. You have to marry me. You have to be my 107th wife. Yes, I know he didn't have that many, but whatever. And there are more newspaper and journal reports of violence and robbery committed by the Mormons than we have time to cover in this episode. We could probably go months with covering all of this, but this is just going to be a brief overview. But right in the Joseph Smith papers, we find Mormons being forced to pay damages due to their violence. In the Joseph Smith papers in 1838, it's made clear that Mormons were, again, forced to pay damages that were caused by the Danites. It says here, previous to the arrival of General Clark, the Mormons were gathered together, about 500, made to sign a deed of trust, in which 5 commissioners were appointed, to whom they deeded all their property in trust for the use of all the creditors of the church, and also to pay the damages done by the Danites, and then the overplus, if any, was to be refunded. So members of the church are literally paying for the damages caused by the Danites. It's insane.
It just goes to show that the church kind of covers this up and doesn't really say a whole lot, but yet you go through the Joseph Smith papers and it really paints a very realistic picture of what was going on, and it's not what members of the church are told.
Yeah.
So here we have on July 27th, 1838, thus far, according to the order of the Danites, we have a company of Danites in these times to put to right physically that which is not right, and to cleanse the church of very great evils, which hath hitherto existed among us, inasmuch as they cannot be put to right by teaching and persuasion. This company, or a part of them, exhibited on the 4th day of July. So again, this is in the Joseph Smith papers. And he's saying that we're going to put things right, but if we can't do it by teaching and persuasion, we're going to enact something by the Danites. It doesn't sound very good. Yeah. So as you read through this, it becomes clear that the Danites' purpose wasn't to protect the prophet. In the above entry, the Danites were to put right physically, which was not right, and to cleanse the church. So if you can't persuade or teach someone, what is it that you are insinuating these Danites are supposed to do to these, quote, evil people who are not abiding by the teachings of the church? Well, we're going to detail later what these Danites were actually doing to these people in the church that were either losing their faith or not following what the leaders of the church wanted them to be doing. As we continue through the Joseph Smith papers in 1838, we find that the Danites taught that a February 1831 revelation granted them license. And this is what Joseph Smith said, in quote, "Take yourselves spoils of the goods of the ungodly Gentiles, for it is written, the riches of the Gentiles shall be consecrated to my people of the house of Israel." So basically, Joseph Smith is saying steal from anyone that's not a member of the church. And he calls them ungodly people. The Mormons believe that they are of the house of Israel and everyone else in the world are Gentiles. Joseph Smith taught them that the people of Missouri were ungodly and that their possessions were to be given to the Mormons because God told them he would consecrate it to them. This is what the Mormons were actually doing. They were stealing from these people, and they saw these people as ungodly and unrighteous. It's no wonder that the people of Missouri did not like the Mormons. Also, they were very concerned about all the rumors about polygamy, which was illegal at the time. You wonder why they were being driven out of Missouri. Their attitudes towards anyone that was not Mormon were hostile. And we have documentation that they are stealing from the people of Missouri. They are burning innocent people's homes. The Mormons were not being persecuted for their faith. They were driven out because they were breaking the law by stealing from the people of Missouri, burning down their homes, and living in polygamy, which was against the law. As we continue in this entry in the Joseph Smith papers on March 1839, this is kind of between October 1838 and March 1839, some church members organized into militia groups and attacked settlements that they claimed were harboring anti-Mormon vigilantes. So these are innocent people. They're just claiming that they are harboring anti-Mormon people. They confiscated livestock and other goods from these people, quote, to be used for the saints. So here we have another example of this happening. The Danites were also involved in forcing members of the church to consecrate their property to the church. This is that law of consecration. And again, a lot of members think this is a voluntary thing. It's this higher law that if you're righteous enough, you can live this way. No, the Danites were forcing members to submit their property to the church. In 1831, Joseph Smith declared that he had a revelation that outlines the laws of the Church of Christ for consecrating property to the church. He claimed it was to assist the poor. By 1838, the church had enacted several ways to organize this consecration of property. According to church member Luman Shirtliff, he was attached with all he possessed to a co-op firm led by Isaac Morley, who was a counselor in the Far West Bishopric. Although Joseph Smith taught that participation in these kind of co-op firms was voluntary, dissenters John Corll and Reed Peck later stated that Samson Avard and other Danites resorted to coercion to force participation in these co-ops.
Yeah, and Samson Avard actually shared information with John B. Clark based on that information. And Clark concluded that the Latter-day Saints, quote, have societies formed under the most binding covenants in form and the most horrid oaths to circumvent the laws and put them at defiance and to plunder and burn and murder and divide the spoils for the use of the church. This is what they call the Danite Club or Society. And here we see reference to the most horrid oaths to circumvent the laws, to plunder, burn, murder, split up spoils. And when members of the LDS Church claimed that the early church was persecuted, they failed to acknowledge the reality that these early Mormons were not peaceful at all, not by any stretch of the imagination. The persecution they faced was directly tied to their own arrogant actions. You can see here, they're plundering, they're burning, they're murdering. All this awful stuff. No wonder they are being driven out from all of these different places. And the next day, second counselor Hiram Smith and his uncle John Smith, who was an assistant counselor in the first presidency, joined with Danite leader Samson Avard and 80 other Danites in signing a threatening letter to Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, John Whitmer, Lyman E. Johnson, and William W. Phelps. And presidency counselor John Smith was the only general authority who signed both this 1838 warning and the earlier warning to Kirkland's Justice of the Peace. This Danite threat instructed these excommunicated dissenters to depart, or a more fatal calamity shall befall you. Here you can see in writing the type of violent threats that were made against the dissenters of the early church. And Danites were absolutely threatening violence to anyone, against anyone outside of the church. Many LDS people are unaware that the Danites and the church leaders not only threatened violence against individuals who have been excommunicated or had left the church, but we're looping back to under the reign of Brigham Young, this violence was perpetrated and many were blood atoned, or in more accurate terms, they were murdered. Ebenezer Robinson, who also signed the Danite document, later wrote that all the signers were members of the recently organized Danite military organization, and he added that he was told in June of 1838 that the document itself was gotten up in the office of the first presidency. So the first presidency of the church knows what's going on. Avard specified that Counselor Rigdon wrote the text of this Danite ultimatum, although the Danites, who had been organized primarily for external security against the possibility of Missouri mobs, they now functioned as an organization for internal security to intimidate and possibly kill dissenting Mormons. So here we see another person who signed this Danite document detailing that Danite's purpose was to intimidate, and he clearly states, possibly kill dissenting Mormons. So I guess me and you would be killed for dissenting.
Yep.
There's so many despicable things that were happening with these Danites, and obviously the church does not want anyone to know about them.
Yeah, I mean they're flat out stating this in this document that was part of their purpose, was to intimidate and possibly kill. Now I will say today you don't get killed for losing your faith or leaving the church. Yeah, thank goodness. But you will be shunned. Mm-hmm. So leaders of the church will paint those who have doubts or those who leave as lax disciples, lazy learners. They will say that you were easily offended. You got offended by someone at church. And I want to say I had a Relief Society president come to my house to talk to me because I had not been to church in a while. And she flat out asked me if I had been offended and who it was and if there was something they could do. And I was like, I was never offended by anyone. I don't have a problem with anyone in the ward. It was nothing like that. But this is what they're taught. They're taught that you've been deceived by seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. And they state these things in their general conferences. And it creates a divide between members and those who have left the church. And I think there's a reason, because all this information, usually that people start finding out prior to leaving the church, they don't want members to know. So they're going to create a divide. They don't kill you, but they're definitely going to paint you as this evil person that's been deceived by Satan, so that members will not talk to you or listen to anything you have to say. Mm-hmm. So let's move into Brigham Young's use of the Danites. This is where it gets really violent really quickly. These Danites were the ones that were blood atoning people. And in Analyze's book, we didn't really detail this, but I do want to mention, she mentions many, many, many times where people would lose their faith. They would want to move on. So they would be deciding maybe to move on to California or to go back east or whatever. And she said that these Danites, you would hear word later that this family who was leaving were later found dead. And they always blamed it on the Native Americans. And it was not. It was the Danites who were doing this. So that was something that was very common, but we're going to detail some of the stories, just not all of them. So this is from Anne Eliza's book again, but I am going to verify this with actual court documents. And I did this as I read her book. I was always able to verify everything she said in the Journal of Discourses, Joseph Smith papers, court documents. She was very meticulous in what she said. And I've always found everything that she said to be easily verifiable. So here is her story. A woman named Jones and her son, who lived in Payson, Utah, they were suspected of falling away in the faith. That's it. They gave them other grave charges, but it really was falling away in the faith. Those were the charges brought against them, for which it was deemed necessary that they should die. One night, there was a great commotion in the streets of the town. Pistol shots were heard. There was a sound of hurrying feet, a murmur of voices, and a subdued excitement lasting all night. No one dared to venture out to learn the cause, lest their curiosity should be summarily punished. In those days, it was dangerous to seek to know more than the priesthood chose to tell. In fact, everything but a blind following of fanatical doctrines was dangerous. Free thought was suicidal. The morning following the night of which I have spoken put an end to the suspense. It was proclaimed everywhere that the Joneses had been killed, and their dead bodies, shockingly mutilated, were placed in a wagon and exposed to the crows by being driven through the streets, attended by a jeering, taunting mob who would not cease their insults, though their victims were still in death. I did not see the bodies, nor did my mother. Although they were driven past our door, we both shunned the fearful sight. And this is on page 139 of her book, Wife Number 19. So she was an eyewitness in the sense that these bodies were driven in front of her house. She was hearing the jeering, the taunting. She was hearing all of this and knowing that these bodies were being driven in front of her house. So she did have somewhat of a witness of this. We've referenced this book by Brigham Young's wife, Anne Eliza. But like I said, I've referenced everything in it, and all the information she provides is very accurate. But if you don't believe her account of this story, there are court documents detailing the murder of Henry Jones and his mother. So this is an affidavit of Nathaniel Case on the murder of Henry Jones and his mother in the territory of Utah. So this is a sworn affidavit that was submitted to the court in Provo, Utah. It says, Nathaniel Case, being sworn, says that he has resided in the territory of Utah since the year 1850, lived with Bishop Hancock, named Charles Hancock, in the town of Payson, Utah, at the time Henry Jones and his mother were murdered, about April 13th, 1858. The night prior to the murder, a secret council meeting was held in the upper chamber of Bishop Hancock's house. He saw Charles Hancock, George W. Hancock, Daniel Rawson, James Bracken, George Patton, and Price Nelson go into that meeting that night. Meetings had been held pretty regularly for 3 weeks before the last one in that same place. I was not in any of the meetings. I boarded, so meaning he was living at this bishop's house. About 8 o'clock in the evening of the murder, the company gathered at Bishop Hancock's. The same persons I have named above were in the company. They said they were going to, quote, guard a corral where Henry Jones was going to come that night and steal horses. They had guns. I had a good mini rifle, and Bishop Hancock wanted to borrow it. I refused to lend it to him. The above persons all went away together. I don't know what time they got back. Next morning, I heard that Henry Jones and his mother had been killed. I went down to the dugout where they lived when the sun was about an hour high. The old woman was lying on the ground in the dugout on a little straw in the clothes in which she was killed. She had a bullet hole through her head, entering near the center of the forehead. In about 15 or 20 minutes, Henry Jones was brought there and laid by her side. They then threw some old bedclothes over them and an old feather bed, and then pulled the dugout on top of them. The dugout was built on level ground, and then he kind of goes to explain, how they were buried there. The next Sunday after the murder, in a church meeting in Payson, Charles Hancock, who was the bishop, as to the killing of Jones and his mother, he said he cared nothing about it, and it would have been done in daylight of circumstances if they had permitted it. This was said from the stand in church. There were 150 or 200 persons present in church that day. He had no reason for killing them. So here we have Nathaniel Case. He was sworn and signed on April 9th, 1859, and this was taken by Judge John Cradlebaugh. So here we have a court document claiming the murder of these people because of the loss of their faith.
Yeah, and we also have a statement from Colonel William H. Dane Parowan, and this was in Iron County, Utah. And he says, I claim that Brigham Young is the real criminal, and that John D. Lee, who was one of the Danites, was an instrument in his hands. That Brigham Young used John D. Lee as the assassin, throws away the dagger to avoid its bloody blade, leading to his detection. So Brigham Young used John D. Lee to do his horrid work.
And this is about the Mountain Meadow Massacre.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, this is all about the Mountain Meadow Massacre, which we'll cover in later podcasts, which it's such a tragic story, and really we couldn't do it justice throwing it into this episode. So in the future, we'll do a full one on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And the Mormons around Cedar City, especially, were insane dreamers, and to them, the Danites, destroying angels and blood atoners, became objects of ecstatic admiration. And you can find this in Mormonism Unveiled by John D. Lee, who was actually a Danite, and this was on page 15. So here we've actually got a list of, a partial list of members who, or members of the Danite group. And here's only a small portion. If you actually go online, you can see the full list of this partial list online. It appears I've neglected to include the link on the slide. I'll make sure it is included when I post these slides in the description of the video. Also, we've got a few quotes here. We got one from Heber C. Kimball. He says, I do pray for my enemies. I pray God Almighty to damn them. Wow. Saying God needs to damn his enemies. Then we got one from Brigham Young, and this was in the Journal of Discourses. He says, now keep your tongue still, or sudden destruction will come upon you. Rather than apostates shall flourish here, I will unsheath my bowie knife and conquer or die. Wow. So basically saying he's going to use his bowie knife to either the apostates need to leave, or he will use his bowie knife against them, or die trying.
Yep.
Wow, it is insane how far he takes it. And then he continues on. I would take that bosom pin I used to wear in Nauvoo and cut his dead throat from ear to ear. And
cut his damned throat.
Damned throat, thank you so much. It's cut out on the thing I'm
reading. It is.
Cut his damned throat from ear to ear, saying, go to hell across lots.
Yeah, and he does say such a man should be cut off just below the ears as well.
Oh, thank you so much. I accidentally skipped over that. The way he's talking about what he's going to do to members who leave the church is insane. This is the second prophet of the LDS Church talking like this. Imagine what would happen if a modern prophet talks like Brigham Young did. Yeah. It is insane.
And at the time, they were not part of the United States. And so Brigham Young was leader of the church and governor. And so he was the law.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is so true. Thank you for pointing that out. Also, we have a statement from Judge John Cradlebaugh concerning the Mountain Meadows Massacre at the House of Representatives, February 23rd, 1863. It says, they teach the shedding of blood for remission of sins, or in other words, that if a Mormon apostatizes, his throat shall be cut, and his blood poured out upon the ground for the remission of sins. They also practice other revolting doctrines, such as are only carried out in polygamous countries, which is evidenced by a number of, multitude persons in their midst. So at variance is the practice of polygamy with all the instincts of humanity, that it has to be pressed upon the people with greatest
assiduity.
Thank you. As part of their religious duty. It's astonishing with what personality, through all their sermons and discourses, it is justified and insisted on. Threats, persecutions, and commands are continually brought into play to enforce its cheerful observance. So revolting is it to the women that to aid in its enforcement, they are brutalized, their modesty destroyed by low, vile, vulgar expressions, such as I could not repeat, and would not ask the clerk to read in your hearing. His, speaking of Brigham Young here, deluded followers yield him implicit obedience, and a church organization known as the Danites or Destroying Angels stands ready to protect his person or avenge his wrongs, to execute his pleasure. Brigham defiantly drives the barbaric chariot of Mormon robbery, murder, polygamy, and incest over all law, in defiance of all federal officials in the territory. Brigham Young not only controls the legislation, but he controls the courts. So kind of like we touch on here, Brigham Young is not only the leader of the church, but he is leader of he controls the legislation. He controls the courts. He is everything out there.
Yeah, he is the law. So I want to kind of emphasize, he is speaking before the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. This is a judge who was a judge in Provo, Utah for years. He is not LDS, but he has overseen a lot of court cases, and he is very familiar with how the courts and the law works in Utah. And he is speaking before the House of Representatives here. He very astutely knows the truth about how the Mormons were conducting themselves. And he is saying they were violent, they committed murder, they committed incest. This is in a testimony before the House of Representatives. He's accusing them of incest, of violence, of murder, polygamy. He is saying that women were treated vulgarly and terribly. And you can read this entire testimony. We didn't read the whole thing here. The testimony gets absolutely shocking. So I would highly recommend that you click the link and read the rest of this, because he details all of the horrors of polygamy that have probably shocked a lot of people. And I think it's really important to understand that this man had very intimate knowledge and details of the inner workings of the Mormons and the law. So let's move into a journal entry by a woman whose husband was killed by the Danites. So here we have another murder by the Danites. And she says this: I married Jesse Hartley knowing he was a Gentile, but he passed for a Mormon. That made no difference with me, although I was a Mormon, because he was a noble man and sought only the right. By being my husband, he was brought into closer contact with the members of the church, and he was thus soon enabled to learn many things about us and about the heads of the church that he did not approve, and of which I was ignorant, although I had been brought up among the saints, and which, if known among the Gentiles, would have greatly damaged us. I do not understand all that he discovered or all that he did, but they found he had written against the church. So he had written something against the church, and he was cut off. And the prophet, who would have been Brigham Young at the time, required an atonement for his sins. So because he wrote something that was against the church, Brigham Young wanted this man to submit to blood atonement, that he should lay down his life. So she continues, that he should be sacrificed in the endowment room of the temple. I want to emphasize that again. Brigham Young was asking this man to be sacrificed or blood atoned in an endowment room in the temple, where human sacrifices were sometimes made in this way. I bet a lot of people did not know that human sacrifices were done in the endowment rooms of the temple in the early church. This I never knew until my husband told me, but it is true. They kill those there who have committed sins too great to be atoned for in any other way. The prophet says, if they submit to this, he can save them. Otherwise, they are lost. Oh, that is terrible. But my husband refused to be sacrificed, and so set out alone for the United States. So They were not in the United States. He's setting out east to go back to the United States for safety. Thinking there might be at least a hope of success, I told him when he left me and left his child that he would be killed, and so he was. William Hickman and another Danite shot him in the canyons, and I have often since been obliged to cook for this man when he passed this way, knowing all the while he had killed my husband. My child soon followed after his father, and I hope to die also, for why should I live? They have brought me here where I wish to remain, rather than to return to Salt Lake, where the murders of my husband curse the earth and roll in affluence unpunished. Very, very powerful statement.
Yeah. Like on at this point, if like you can really see how far these Danites took. Like, oh no, this man said something against the church or published something against the church, and then he is killed, leaving his
Yep.
wife a widow with a child.
Yep.
The
And then the child's later killed.
and the child was like, "Thank you so much," and
Yeah.
I, it's awful, and we also have correspondence of the New York Tribune, and this was written in May 19th, 1857. And, and it's by William Smith, brother of Joseph Smith. It says, I will here remark also that all the plans for this Mormon treason against the government were laid in councils at Nauvoo, previous to the expulsion of the saints from the state of Illinois, an expulsion caused by the wicked doings of the corrupt Danite leaders, including robberies and murders. While the Mormons were yet at Nauvoo, Brigham Young took the incipient steps toward the organization of the Danites banditti by administering to such Mormons as he could influence an oath that from that time forward they would be persistent enemies of the United States government and the Gentiles generally. Since their removal from Illinois, they have added the Danites and other treasonable oaths and covenants, binding still stronger and stronger the confederacy of traitors in their new and far-off land of Zion in the valley of the mountains. I have no doubt whatever of the truth of the charges against the Mormon people, of having committed the most wanton and cruel murders in the disguise of Indians. And if the spirits of their victims now sleeping in their graves at Nauvoo could but speak to the world, they would reveal tales of cruelty and horror which would make the people stand aghast and cause these murderous, guilty Mormon rebels to quake with fear and possibly to recoil at the contemplation of their own wickedness. These are some very strong words, and honestly, I completely agree that the actions that these Danites were doing would make people stand aghast. And
this is testimony of Joseph Smith's brother.
Oh yes,
You know, I mean, this is what Joseph Smith's brother is saying about these people. Very important.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And Joseph Smith's brother is going to be very close and knows what's going on. And this continues saying, I have good reason for believing that my brother Samuel H. Smith died of poison at Nauvoo, administered by order of Brigham Young and Willard Richards. Irene Hodge, a young woman, was murdered in most shocking manner within 10 or 15 yards of Brigham Young's house. This was done as the Mormons themselves admitted to prevent some developments coming out in the exposure of Brigham's guilty connection with the banditti of murderers and counterfeiters who in those days of flourishing Mormonism ranged along the Mississippi River from St. Louis, Missouri to Galena, Illinois. Also, Brigham Young in connection with John Taylor, A. Lyman, Parley P. Pratt, E. Snow, and Heber C. Kimball, George Smith, Wilford Woodruff, Orson Hyde, Willard Richards, who was dead at the time, Hosea Stouts, and Orson Pratt, who was killed a few days before this, and others known as the principal leaders of Mormons, were founders of the secret Danite banditti or destroying angels, as are called by the Mormons. In regard to the designs of these Mormons to rob and plunder the Californian immigrants and to commit certain, I apologize, I do not know some of the words he's using here.
Depredations,
thank you so much, upon the general government to hoax, fool, and to gull money out of them under various pretenses. I testify that I have heard Mormons boast and talk of these designs in Nauvoo previous to their leaving for the Salt Lake Valley, and have also often heard Mormons talk openly of their designs in robbing the Gentiles and of putting to death dissenting Mormons, and that also when they got among Indians, they would lead them onto the slaughter of the men, women, and the children of the American people. Suffice it to say that in presenting to Congress my remonstrance to these views of Mormons, and at the time I have mentioned, I greatly endangered my life. So again, this is Joseph Smith's brother saying this and presenting to Congress this statement. It continues on, and we'll go through that in just a moment, saying that he's greatly endangered his life in presenting this. He's trying to let someone know everything that the Mormons are doing, all these awful, awful acts.
The thing is, we have testimony. We even have sworn affidavit testimony of multiple people saying the Mormons are murdering people. They are robbing from the Gentiles. They are putting to death dissenting Mormons. We have Annalisa Webb. We have Joseph Smith's brother. We have William Law, who was in the first presidency with Joseph Smith. All of these people coming out and saying these things. You cannot disregard this when we have sworn affidavits and so many people stating the same thing. So we're going to keep going on with his testimony. He says, I escaped the penalty of the Danite law, which is death. But the Mormons robbed me of all my property, confiscated everything I possessed, including a library of valuable books, also valuable manuscripts and records of church history prepared for the press. One of these manuscripts, Orson Pratt, who was a leading Danite, so here we have Joseph Smith's brother telling us Orson Pratt was a Danite, published in England, which has since been extensively circulated in Europe and various parts of the United States. The terrible measures resorted to by the destroying angels or Danites in visiting their vengeance upon their foes should open the eyes of the people of this country and keep them on guard for their safety. These demon Danites are constantly on the alert for their prey. In conclusion, permit me to say that I am not a Mormon. The treachery, corruption, and murderous practices of the leaders of the Mormon Church long since disgusted me with a doctrine which produces such results. And as a matter of course, I left the heaven-defying traitors, as every honest man should do, and leave the guilty wretches to suffer the fate which they so richly merit, and which is certain sooner or later to overtake them. The guilty and treasonable oath which 40 or 50,000 Mormons now in the Salt Lake Valley and many others scattered in all parts of the country have taken upon themselves at the hands of Brigham Young and the Danite followers is as follows. Now, I want you to realize the oath that the treasonable oath that Joseph Smith's brother is talking about, that upwards of 50,000 Mormons had taken this treasonable oath. They took this as a part of their endowment. Mm-hmm. Mormon members of the church, LDS members of the church, still do the endowment today. They don't make this treasonous oath. But back then, Brigham Young had them take this treasonous oath. And this was this was something that came out. And there were, as we talked about, members of Congress that had taken this oath that is treasonous. So we're going to read it to you and you can see for yourself. So the oath is as follows. You do solemnly swear in the presence of Almighty God, his holy angels, and these witnesses that you will avenge the blood of Joseph Smith on this nation and teach the same to your children, and that you will from this time henceforth and forever begin and carry out hostilities against the nation, to keep the same intent a profound secret now and forever, so help you God. Now, the language of this changed a little bit over time, but this treasonous oath was made in the LDS Temple endowment. So this is another publication. This was published in Democrat and Chronicle in 1902. So this was published in New York on October 3rd, 1902. Those who believe that William Hooper Young killed Mrs. Pulitzer to carry out the doctrine of blood atonement according to the Mormon faith will be convinced by the stories told by Miss Ella Knight of Clyde, New York, just returned from Utah. Young and pretty Miss Knight went to Salt Lake City, where she is advertised as an elocutionist. Her real motive in going among the Mormons was to do missionary work among the women, seeking to win them away from the polygamous faith of Brigham Young. The pretty woman is a zealous member of the Women's Home Missionary Society. Miss Knight spent several years among the Mormons. She was among them when Roberts, the Mormon, was fighting for a seat in Congress. When he was defeated, Miss Knight said that a Mormon elder said to her, "I tell you, Miss Knight, the United States government shall suffer for Mr. Roberts' defeat, for we shall avenge it by the shedding of blood."
Yeah, and to a reporter, Miss Knight said to one who has lived in Utah, there can be no doubt that the doctrine of the blood atonement still exists. All the wrongs are to be weighed by the shedding of blood. A deserter from the church can only atone for his sin by giving up his life's blood. The destroying angel who kills the sinner is absolved from all sin. So basically, the person who commits the murder is absolved from all sin. You're fine. You're good. You basically killed a dissenter. Is basically what they're saying here. And it is the fact that it is to call of the destroying angels set apart by the church to do this work of assassination. Continues on saying, naturally, the most degenerate and desperate creatures that the church can command are the ones chosen for this purpose. In the case of Young, who has himself been a backslider, then presuming that he sought again to enter the fold, his quickest and surest method to full restoration among the faithful who would be to do the work of a destroying angel with some other backsliders. This is no exaggeration of the workings of this ghastly feature of a strange and cruel faith. Holy cow.
Yeah.
Basically, yeah, I can't believe this. Like, these Danites, they can murder all these dissenters and anyone who speaks bad about the church and no repercussions for it. We've also got a statement written by a former Danite, John D. Lee. Says, William Laney of Harrisburg, Utah Territory, had formed the acquaintance of the family of Aden while on a mission to Tennessee. He was saved from a mob who threatened his death because he was a Mormon preacher. For when Francis Train reached Parowan, Mr. Laney met young Aden and recognized him as a son of the man who saved his life. Aden told him that he was hungry and that he and his comrades had been unable to purchase supplies from the Mormons ever since they left Salt Lake City, and that there appeared to be a conspiracy that had been formed against that train by which the Mormons had agreed to starve the immigrants.
Yep, I've heard this in multiple places.
Yes.
They did this to the people of the Mountain Meadows Massacre as well.
That is true, they did.
Yeah.
And this continues on, saying, Laney took young Aden to his house, gave him his supper, and let him sleep there that night. The next day, Laney was accused by leading men with being unfaithful to his obligations. They said he had supported the enemies of the church and given aid and comfort to those whose hands were still red with the blood of the prophets. A few nights after that, the destroying angels, who were doing the bidding of Bishop Dame, were ordered to kill William Laney to save him from his sons, he having violated his endowment oath and furnished food to a man who had been declared an outlaw by the Mormon Church. So at this point, you can't even help an outsider. Provide them food. Otherwise, you are killed.
Yep, it is that bad. So we go on. The angels, or destroying angels, were commanded by Barney Carter, a son-in-law of Bishop Dame, who now lives in Los Angeles County, California. The angels called Laney out of the house, saying that Bishop Dame wished to see him. As Laney passed through the gate into the street, he was struck across the back of the head with a large club by Barney Carter. His skull was fractured somewhat, and for many months Laney lay at the point of death, and his mind still shows the effects of the injury he then received, for his brain has never quite settled since. I have frequently talked with Laney about this matter, but as he was fully initiated into the mysteries of the church, meaning the endowments and all of that, and being privy to the Danites, he knows that he will yet be killed if his life can be taken with safety. If he makes public the facts connected with the conspiracy to take his life, he is still strong in the Mormon faith. This surprises me, and almost believes that Dame had the right to have him killed. At the time Carter attempted to take the life of Laney, the Mormon Church was under the blaze of the Reformation, and punishment by death was the penalty for refusing to obey the orders of the priesthood. So basically, if you refuse to obey any order of any man in the priesthood above you, it was punishable by death. And this is in the Winslow Farr diary. This was a September entry for, an entry for March 19th, 1857. This is in the Church History Library. And it says, Thursday 19th, I spent most of the day in hunting cows, but did not find them grubbed with some willows in the afternoon. Went to the evening meeting. I heard some good preaching and was glad to hear that the law of God had been put in force in Springville on some men who deserved it. So he's referencing the Danites who had killed some men in Springville. So during the Reformation, it was very, very, very common for members of the church to be fully in support of this blood atonement and of people being killed. As you see, he said, hey, these men deserved it. And this man who was beaten over the head and his skull fractured, he believed he deserved it. And if you go through the Journal of Discourses and a lot of Brigham Young's teachings and preachings and discourses and all of that, he was violent, and he was constantly stressing violence and force of women into polygamy and telling the women to shut up and stop their whining. And these people believed what he said. And it's absolutely devastating to see the effects, how many people were killed and what was done under the terrorizing reign of Brigham Young.
Absolutely. It's insane. Like that poor guy who believes that he deserved what happened to him. That just baffles me that he was still a part of the church. It's just, I can't believe it. But yeah, that's all we have for today. Our next episode, we're going to go into a little bit more detail, not necessarily about the Danites, but all of the violent activities that were going on around the same time. So make sure you stay tuned for just under 2 weeks. We'll have that episode released, and hopefully we don't have any more technical difficulties with that episode. But thank you all so much for watching. As a reminder, we do have that coffee link in the description. So if you do enjoy the content that we create, I strongly encourage you to donate. Even just a couple bucks helps us out so much to be able to keep these things going. But again, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to see you again in 2 weeks.